I think the key points from Blair there, that this was a crisis of the neoliberal model of capitalism. There was failures in policy advice and initiatives, and we need to focus on a citizenship approach rather than consumer approach. I'll hand over now to Bill Kingston, who will present. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to talk to you and to throw out a few new ideas into the bookshop for stocking the book that I'm going to talk to some extent from. I remember being asked by the head of my school in Trinity College at one time to go because he couldn't go up to the IDA, who had invited him and a very distinguished visiting professor. Could I go along to the IDA with this man from abroad, since the head of the school couldn't do it? And I remember going into the information office up in Wilton Place, meeting the head of the IDA at the time and saying that I felt like a Presbyterian invited to dine in the Vatican. Now, let me start out my stall. How do I feel invited to address your particular group? I feel, let me be perfectly frank about it, I feel completely in agreement with everything I've heard, and I was here yesterday. I'm completely in agreement with you, just as I'm totally in agreement with Karl Marx, as far as your diagnosis is concerned. Where you may find my ideas difficult is in what do you do with the diagnosis? What can be done? And this is why I begin by asking the question that everybody in Ireland is asking at the moment, which is, what is to be done? A question which in somewhat similar circumstances, in their contexts, Tolstoy asked in 1883, and Lenin asked in 1902. What is to be done in the awful situation in which we find ourselves? So I'm not going to talk about my diagnosis. If anybody's interested in my diagnosis, the essays over a number of years are collected in Interrogating Irish Policies. We'll give it. We give it. I want to talk today only on remedies. And if you're looking for a remedy, you have to go back to fundamentals, accept the fact the discrepancy between what we want to be and our values, as Niamh Brennan said yesterday. Economic development, let's face it, economic development is a child of the Reformation. And even leaving the religious aspect out of it, if you look at economic development in places like Singapore, under Lee Kuan Yew and his successors, the same values that brought about economic development in places like Singapore are essentially Reformation values. And what are Reformation values? They are values that put the task over social relations. That is, I have to get the task done because my relationship with my God is dependent upon how well I do this particular thing. The whole of the difference between Southern Europe and Northern Europe, between Catholic Europe and Protestant Europe, all of that in economic terms goes back to the Reformation. Now, tribalism inverts those relations. Tribalism puts social relations above the task. I remember we used to give an external diploma in the Sudan, and it was a wonderful education for me and for those of us who were down to teach on it and to examine it, because we saw things like the ESB International coming in to teach the Khartoum Electricity Board how to have a modern, up-to-date organisation. And before the drink was dry on their plan, the whole scheme had been totally wrecked because it didn't fit the tribal relationship. There were 6 vertical divisions, for example, and the president's cousin had to be fitted into this. He couldn't fit into any of the 6, therefore they made a 7th and took away bits from all the other 6, totally wrecking what the ESB had done. So tribalism is a wonderful thing because it spreads whatever little wealth there is out to the poorest, but it can never generate wealth. If you look at the appalling history of Africa, in spite of all the money that's come from the West to it, this is a classic example of the problem. Now, how does this relate to Ireland? It's very simple. We want to be a modern industrial nation, but we also want to retain our tribalism. I don't have to say any more about that because Niamh Brennan said it at her all yesterday. The Irish electoral system, which, as he's pointed out, is the most democratic in the world, it perpetuates tribalism, and it puts local pressures on politicians to intervene in the economy, and that means it gives the public service tasks that it can never do well, and often cannot do at all, and rarely are these in the national interest. And look at, for example, at decentralisation. I'm not just talking about what the 3 articles in the Irish Times, because although they were very powerful, but the sole motivation for decentralisation was local electoral advantage. There was no thought at all for the public interest, the country's interest, or the downside. And in fact, untold damage has been done to the performance of the public service by decentralisation. I'll just give you 2 examples. At one point, we were way ahead of the British in terms of our approach to ocean energy, particularly in terms of the issuing of foreshore licenses and things like that that have to be got if you're going to do anything in the ocean to capture the energy that's there. The foreshore energy section of the Department of the Board of Works was decentralised to Clonakilty, and none of the people who knew all about this would go. So the only people who went to Clonakilty were people from other parts of the public service who knew nothing whatever about foreshore licenses and went to Clonakilty because that's where they came from and they want to get home. The same thing within the Department of External Affairs, the foreign aid section, staffed by very devoted people who loved Africa, loved the people, who were determined to show how the money was spent. They were being decentralised to Limerick. And who goes to Limerick? None of the people who know what is to be done will go to Limerick. So Limerick is now staffed, that section is now staffed in Limerick by people who only want to be back in Limerick and haven't the slightest interest in the third world. So the damage of decentralisation was enormous, and the damage through decentralisation was done by what Niamh was talking about yesterday, the tribalism of our electoral system. Now, what can we do about it? Well, I've been arguing for a long time and here I take issue with Blair. Blair wants more responsibility in the public service. I don't believe you can get that. You cannot apply, and he's right with what he was saying earlier on, you cannot apply private sector conditions to the public sector. Somebody who goes into the civil service goes in and used to give his or her life to the job. I'll talk later on about the change, the terrible change that has happened in that case. So, but in those circumstances, you cannot ask people to accept responsibility in the same way as people in the private sector have to accept responsibility. But one thing we can do to bring responsibility into it, we can bring in whistleblowing. You can't go, take any public service failure over the last 20 years. The guards in Donegal, the appalling blood transfusion scandal. There's not a single one of them where there wasn't somebody in the system who could have shouted stop. There were people who knew what was going on, and the most important thing of all is that if you have a whistleblowing system, the fear that the whistle may be blown is going to stop most of these misdemeanors in their tracks. And to give you an example of that, you only have to look at the Banks disaster. And I'll read to you, because I don't think you have the paper that Tony copied yet, or all of them. This is from the Honohan report. Intrusive demands from line staff could be and were set aside after direct representations were made to senior regulators. Also, attempts to formalise some of the principles through directors' compliance statements and the corporate governance code both came to naught following industry lobbying. Now, what does that do to the morale of the people who go into the banks, find something wrong, go back, report it to the regulator, and that can be dealt with by a phone call from the head of Irish Banks or Ireland, wherever it is. It destroys morale in the people who are actually doing the work. And if we had a proper whistleblowing system, we could, as I say, the very fear that it might be used would stop so much industry? Am I as the regulator going to be as amenable to the head of the Bank of Ireland or to the AIB or whoever? Am I going to be amenable to him if I know that somewhere down the line somebody can take the initiative and bring what I'm doing to the public? I'm certainly not going to look after myself. So the fear of exposure would have put backbone into the regulator, and staff morale would have been transformed, and there would have been instant action by the opposition and the media. So it's necessary for any bureaucracy, whether the bureaucracy is in the public sector or in the church or anywhere else. But unfortunately, they invariably pay a terrible price. So what we need to do it properly within the public sector is there has to be an independent body outside the system to whom somebody can go to be relieved from their oath of secrecy. And I say the very fact of that. And then they must have real compensatory power to make sure, because whistleblowers are always crucified. The whole history of the public sector anywhere, the record is 100% on those lines. But curiously enough, we have in this country a precedent, which almost anybody, I doubt very much if anybody here knows about. We have a precedent for compensating people who lose their public sector jobs. And this was back in the early days of the state, because there has always been corruption. Corruption in the Irish system has always been much worse at the local level than at the national level. It got so bad in 1924 that when it cost £1,000 in brown envelopes to get a dispensary doctorate, they had to bring in the local appointments commission. They had to take more powers away from the local authorities in the 1940s by putting in the county management system. Unfortunately, as we see in the wreckage all around the country, they never took away from the county councils their power to override the permanent employees in their planning offices. So the Section 41 has allowed the appalling misdemeanors in terms of the ghost estates and so on that we're faced with. But so one of the first things they did, they got rid of all the old local. They couldn't touch the permanent civil servants, so they got rid of all. But they were able to get rid of the people who are not protected, and by the treaty, and those people were the local authority officials. They wiped them all out, replaced them with their own people, and eventually what happened was the British government provided the money to allow the Irish government in 1924 to pass an act giving these people pensions of 19/20 of their salaries. Now these people were not actually whistleblowers, though there was one whistleblower in there, and it's maybe of interest to this particular group because in the debates you'll see that that famous Labour Party Tom Johnson, he argued that one person shouldn't get this, and the person that he shouldn't get it, he said he didn't get it because he wasn't fired. He had resigned, this fellow had resigned out of loyalty, he said, to the old Irish party. And the minister at the time said, well, he's in there, but it was a narrow shave. So there is a precedent for a system, for doing something that would really make it possible for people to stand up against politicians, because that's the fundamental activity that we need from any higher civil service. The bubble, of course, as Blair has pointed out, we've had an enormous bureaucratic bubble, and all of this growth in the quangos, which he feels has gone too far, that is essentially an attempt on the part of public servants at the top to evade responsibility. And look at any quango. It's there. Its fundamental reason for existence is that it means that the responsibility doesn't have to be taken back in the department. And he's perfectly right when he says we have to get back to having responsibility within the individual department. But of course, we come to this fundamental thing. If we don't get the laws right, no kind of intervention can work. Basically, the whole trouble of the banks here and elsewhere in the world is because of the fact that we moved from a policy of regulating bankers and people who dealt in money by intervention rather than by law. The banking systems of the world operated pretty well until we allowed them to have limited liability. Up to, and interestingly enough, the very first act in the world that said if you handle money, you must handle it on the basis that you are 100% responsible for everything that happens as a result. That is, you're limited, your liability is unlimited. And the very first act was passed just down the road in the old house in College Green in as early as 1720. And then even later on, when we introduced limited liability partnerships, explicitly we refused to allow these partnerships to get the benefit of limited liability if they dealt in money. Naturally enough, no surprise to the people in this group. Naturally enough, the bankers lobbied to get it, and eventually they got it in this part of the world in 1859. And after that, because of their misdemeanor, that led up to the great crash of 1929. The bankers then were regulated again, the Glass-Steagall Act in the United States particularly. They lobbied against that and got out of that again. And they've never been able to be regulated by civil servants. And it's nonsense to pretend that they will be. So if we don't get the laws right, no amount of intervention is going to work. We're not able to deal with it. But as long as I, as a banker, know that I am subject to my whole fortune is subject to being involved in dealing with any debts that I encounter, I'm going to be careful about my lending. So I would argue that we have to rebuild the civil service. We have to rebuild it. It's been totally politicized over the last 20 years. One appalling bit of corruption in it at the very top was the provision allowing for secretaries of departments to retire to retire. No secretary of department can be allowed to serve for longer than 70 years. This means that you have top people in the civil service retiring in their 50s and looking forward to having another job in one of these quangos. And therefore, are these people likely to be the people who will stand up to a minister? They certainly are not, because they are watching where the next job is going to be, and you can see it in the number of assistant secretaries and so on who end up as with their payoff, with their pension, and the very considerable salary for being the head of a quango. So then, some politicians are not going to change the system. If it goes back, if I'm right, and the system is basically due to the fact that we want to be a modern industrial nation, at the same time as we want to preserve our tribal electoral system, the politicians who are elected by this system are not going to change it. And we, as people, we can't, because although in our first constitution, 50,000 votes could get you a referendum, De Valera took that out in the 1937 Constitution. But and you may have noticed that recently the Oireachtas Committee on the Constitution has looked at reform of the electoral system, and they find, surprise, surprise, that there's no compelling need for this. My argument to you just now is that there is an overwhelming compelling need. Now, what can we do about it? It says we can't get a referendum. Well, the last time in this country, this island, that there was a similar level of anger against a government was in 1912. And the anger was the anger against the British government by the Protestants in the north, who formed a covenant saying, we will not be governed from Dublin. Now the anger that's all around us in Ireland at the present time is of a comparable nature to that. And I could even see some sort of covenant where people would face the face the politicians with the next election, they would people would agree that we would face them in the next election with a proposition that we will not vote for you unless you agree that you will go into the Dáil and you will support the initiation of a referendum to do two things. One is to get rid of proportional representation with the single transferable vote, and probably going to the alternative vote, and secondly, halve the number of TDs. This may well happen, but if it doesn't happen, we are condemned to go on indefinitely in the appalling situation which we found ourselves, where we have shown that we cannot govern ourselves with the present system. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill. Bill identified the key question as what is to be done, and then outlined the need for a substantial whistleblowing system, whistleblowing framework, a legal framework for finance to operate in, not merely a regulatory framework, and the need for a reform of electoral system. Finally ending up by putting forward a proposal that there's a people's proposition ahead of the next election to get rid of pure STV and half the number of TDs. I'd like now to welcome Marie Sherlock, who's going to present this. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. First, I just want to thank the committee for inviting me here today. It's my first time at the Green School, so I'm very honoured to have been asked to speak. I suppose just in reflecting on the challenges for the public services here and now, if we thought that those working in the public sector had problems 12 months ago with the prospect of further pay cuts and the onslaught about the supposed bloatedness and excesses of the public sector, then I think the next 3 months are almost certainly going to be a lot worse, both internally in terms of the reforms and the changes that will have to be negotiated and worked through, and more seriously in terms of the looming debate that's going to take place on the composition of the upcoming budget. And I think in this upcoming budget, some of the media will have up on bright lights that the public sector workers will be protected at the expense of the lowest paid workers, who will be targeted to generate additional income tax revenues, and social welfare recipients who will be once again hit by harsh cuts. And to be fair, these headlines would be entirely justified. After all, public sector workers with permanent posts are by and large, have by and large secure employment, were it not for the inconvenient fact that public sector workers have already had an actual gross pay cut of close to 12% if you take a typical salary of €50,000 imposed upon them, and that 3/5 of the total public sector workforce are not high earners but earn less than €40,000 per year. I suppose there's no doubt that the Croke Park Agreement is going to come under some dreadful pressure over the coming weeks, and while some within the union movement would have argued that the agreement didn't deliver enough, I think in the outside world the argument would be very forcefully put that the agreement simply went too far. And a line of argument would be that public sector workers have been shielded from the worst of the crisis. But yet, when we compare the reductions in both the public and the private sector, we clearly see that the claims of mass pay cuts of 15 to 20% in the basic pay of private sector workers has been grossly exaggerated. And I don't doubt at all that the cuts of this magnitude have been imposed in some jobs, and indeed I'm sure there's many of us here who do know people who have had to face major cuts, but it is false to suggest that this has been widespread across the economy. For many months, the SRI and others have lamented the lag in the Central Statistics Office data and have complained that in some ways the small reductions in the public sector pay found by the CSO was in some ways an underestimation. Yet pay studies from IBEC and other human resource companies consistently showed up that the actual scope of pay cuts in the private sector was confined to about 30% of firms, and that pay freezes were the norm rather than the exception. This past Friday, the CSO have released their pay data for all of 2009 and including the first quarter of 2010. And we see that for the private sector overall, there was a reduction of 4.7% in weekly earnings over the past 5 quarters. So comparing from when the public service pension levy was first introduced in the first quarter of 2009 up until when the pay cut was introduced in the first quarter of 2010. So that's taking in 5 quarters. So we see in the private sector, while there was in the public sector there was a cut of about 12%, in the private sector overall we're looking at a cut of about 4.7% across the economy as a whole. And very interestingly, this is not, of course, evenly distributed amongst workers. Managers and professionals were the least affected, with an average 4.2% cut over these 5 quarters. But of course, production, transport, craft and other manual workers suffered a 9.7% reduction in their gross weekly pay. Which is certainly very stark and says an awful lot about where the pain of the crisis has been inflicted upon over this past year. So in getting back to the challenges that face the public services and the public sector at this point in time, I think looking ahead, the greatest job of work will be to communicate and demonstrate that in exchange for the commitments on pay in the Croke Park deal, that real reform is happening. There have been some great improvements in public service delivery in some areas of the public sector over the past number of years. Blair has touched it there in terms of the Passport Office, the Revenue Commissioners, Department of Social Protection. Yet I believe myself, and this is only a personal view, that this hasn't been as well communicated as it might be, and it has been drowned out by everything else that has been going on. Similarly, I think that there is an onus on those unions now involved in public service reform. There's an onus on them to communicate that in order for change to happen, it is not a question of workers coming in on a Monday morning and transforming their mode of operation. Changes to information technology, staff training and other structural, institutional and legislative changes all have to happen in order for these reforms to work. So I think the onus is on ourselves in the union movement to say that, you know, there is a bigger picture here, and it's not just our own members that are going to be part of this reform process. Over the past 24 months, a belief has taken hold that the public services are very much part of the problem rather than part of the solution to this country's economic recovery. And I think most of us here would certainly agree with that. But when we arrived at the stage where the state could no longer afford the public sector in its current form, not because it was too expensive, but because tax revenues plummeted by 33% over a 2-year period, of course the obvious reaction by the government was to cut. And yes, when we look at public sector spending, and Blair certainly gave a very comprehensive account there of the roots of the crisis, of the public finance crisis that we now find ourselves in. Yes, government spending did increase in real terms by about 66% during the period 2000 to 2008. And there was some daft spending and government generated waste, particularly with the formation of a number of government agencies and the farming out of advisory work to private consultancy. But if we put this general increase in context, Irish public spending per capita at about 15,500 euros in 2008 was still only ranked 5th across the whole of the European Union 27, behind the Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, Denmark and Luxembourg. With regard to the government response to the public finances crisis to date, about 71% of the fiscal consolidation over the past 3 budgets has been put on the shoulders of the public sector. And I think we can be all certain that this ratio of cutbacks to tax raising efforts is definitely going to be preserved in the upcoming budget. The government's claim, though, that it wishes to protect services and not repeat the mistakes of the 1980s has been made a complete nonsense of, though, particularly in the community sector, where cuts to the community programmes, where SIPTU has an awful lot of members, the cuts to those programmes has had a devastating impact on the range of services that can be delivered and the number of persons that can be employed to deliver them. In terms of the various agents for change or agents for hope, I suppose if there's one agency or part of the public service that could be instrumental in the effort to bring about a broad-based and far-reaching economic recovery, it is FÁS. And 41%, or about 191,000 people who are on the live register at this point in time, were previously employed as plant and machinery operatives or in the craft professions. And of these, about 4/5 are over the age of 25. At the height of the boom, we knew that about well over a quarter of those employed in construction did not have formal education beyond the junior certificate. Now, this doesn't take into account those who went on to train as under an apprenticeship. But we now know that for those for these people in particular, and for men in particular, that the paths into higher education, to upskill and retrain, are not open to them as they might be to other people who've lost their jobs in this crisis. So there needs to be the universities, there needs to be the Institutes of Technology playing their role in this crisis, but there very much needs to be a public service training agency, a public training agency that very much meets the needs of these people who don't even have their leaving cert and have been cut off in terms of access to these higher education institutions. Yet, rather than standing tall as a force for hope to the many who are now jobless, it's of deep regret that the state training body FÁS has been castigated due to the sins of a few and a dreadful failure of internal systems of accountability and responsibility. And it is really dreadful that these goings-on have really assisted in the caricature of a lazy and inefficient and bloated public service, and of course are far removed from the excellent work of the many trainers and instructors on the ground. And certainly when I talk to our members in FÁS, the morale at the moment is certainly very poor, and the uncertainty that is hanging over the agency at the moment is having a devastating effect with the workers not really knowing what's going to happen into the future. There can be no doubt that improvements need to be made, that greater diversification of courses is required, and that the FÁS organisation needs to be rebranded. We expect that the services sector to account for the bulk of the net job creation when and if the economy does begin to recover. And while support services and administration activities sector has been very badly hit with the crisis, about 28% of the jobs in that sector has been lost over 2008 and 2009. Yet, I suppose when we look to the future, we certainly expect that there's going to be a very significant demand for administration and accounting skills. And I don't think it's unfair to say that FÁS, I suppose, has been very much renowned for the quality of its construction-related courses, but I think it now seriously needs to develop programmes designed for the services in other sectors. However, our great fear now is that with the changes, which hopefully we will have a better idea of over the coming weeks, with the reform of FÁS, the government will push for the creation of a skills agency, which will in effect hollow out the direct training provision element of the organisation. And we're already seeing it in that there has been a stepping up from the number of people I've been talking to anyway. There has been a stepping up certainly in the outsourcing of training courses by FÁS over the past period. The lack of imagination and short-sightedness that has characterised the government attitude in using its public services to assist in the economic recovery to date, I think has been most vividly demonstrated in the kite flying that has been going on with regards to the semi-state companies. While some may expect that the recommendations are a foregone conclusion and that Colm McCarthy will lead the charge for the sale of the family silver, ultimately, notwithstanding what the result is going to be, the conclusion of that report, I think the establishment of the review group should in theory be a good thing for us. Now that may seem very controversial, but it should force us to discuss and justify the ongoing provision of services by the semi-state companies and the critical infrastructure that they provide. It should afford us the chance to dispel some of the myths that have become cemented in the public mindset in terms of pay, and of course, if we've any sense, it should provide the opportunity to the trade union movement to develop and flesh out our proposals for how the semi-states can assist in the economic recovery of this country. For a number of those on the right, the net subsidy to our semi-state companies of about $387.5 million in 2008 principally going to RT and CIE. That represents an intolerable cost burden, particularly when there are private bus companies and television corporations chomping at the bit. And to those semi-states that actually do generate substantial profits, of course, the charge is made that those revenues are inflated by the current regulatory system, particularly the energy sector, and that these in turn have cross-subsidised international activity. But of course the reality is, the fact is, because of government policy to open up the electricity market and to reduce the ESB's market share, the ESB actually incurred losses in its customer supply division in 2008 and 2009. Yes, the selling off of power stations in Ireland has conferred a substantial gain to the semi-state company, to the ESB, but it must be highlighted that 2/5, 41% of last year's profit on the ESB was not generated here in Ireland, but was made abroad. And ultimately what I'm trying to say here is that there's an element of double standards going on with regards to semi-state companies. On one hand, people point to the overseas activities of our state-owned companies, particularly the ESB or Bord Gáis, as evidence of the semi-states going beyond their original remit, and that, that this is an argument that they should be sold off, that they're not necessary. But we wouldn't expect a medium or a large private company in Ireland to survive in the domestic market if they didn't diversify into foreign markets to sustain their base both at home and abroad. It's difficult to think of one company that's dominant here in this country who doesn't have a base outside. Even our largest grocery company, which is obviously not what our largest grocery company has established across the border. About 5 years ago, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions developed proposals for a state holding company, which envisaged the transfer of assets from the existing semi-states into a centralised company, independent of the Department of Finance and the relevant line departments. The state holding company would leverage equity investment by private pension funds or others while retaining majority of control of the semi-state companies. Again, to some, that might have been a controversial proposal at the time, but in order to allow the semi-states to have the flexibility to try and further to leverage their existing assets and to try and have access to greater funding in order to develop their own infrastructure, then I think the view was taken within Congress that this is a very necessary thing. In effect, it was intended to greater corporatise the existing semi-state companies into for fully commercial operations while ensuring the retention of public ownership. And in the context of the review of the semi-state companies, I think these proposals are now particularly apt. I think it would I suppose, cement the position of the state-owned companies in terms of being commercial companies that pay a very healthy dividend back to the state, particularly in the context of our public crisis at the moment. And it would also allow these companies to leverage their assets, to borrow monies, to put into to put towards investment into much needed infrastructure, and of course the jobs that can be created from that. I want to briefly conclude just on I suppose the public finances and the spectacle that awaits us over the coming weeks. The 3 billion, to my mind, has to be found from somewhere. My great fear is that the sum will have to be greater when we look at what's going on at the moment. The government's interest bill for the past year was projected to be about 5.1 billion for 2010, but with the cloud of the banking crisis hanging over and the prospect of the general government deficit hitting about 24% this year, depending on how Eurostat factor in the recapitalisations, this bill is likely to be greater. To be fair to the NTMA, while the yields on the government bonds on the secondary markets have hit that all-important 6% mark this past week, and hit it again last year, the NTMA have managed to sell Irish government bonds at about between 4.5% and 5%. But of course, that's for now. What's going to happen over the coming months? Yes, they have about 80% of this year's government borrowing requirement in their coffers at the moment. But what's going to happen the rest of that 20%? Significant increases in industrial production in the first 2 months of this year, along with a healthy pickup in retail sales during the spring months, seems to have buoyed the government into forecasting that the economy will grow by about 1% of GDP in 2010. and these forecasts came out in July of this year, and of course this is a significant revision from the expectation that GDP was going to decline this year. But after 4 consecutive months of declines in retail sales and a marked slowdown in industrial production up until July of this year, I think this forecast is now in doubt. I noticed Dan O'Brien from the Irish Times yesterday was proclaiming that July and August were fantastic months for industrial production. But if we actually look at the year as a whole, industrial production tends to be very volatile, so we really can't read much into what's happening in 1 month. January and February were fantastic months this year for industrial output, but there was a major dip in the months after that. So we need to be very careful in terms of what we read from 1 month alone. Unless capital spending can be kept some 25% target, as it is at the moment, and if the VAT revenues are going to be ahead of projections as they are at the moment, which I don't think they're going to stay ahead of projections for much longer, then the general government deficit will rise above the 18 billion that the government had projected for this year. The government's fiscal consolidation strategy was built in the expectation that the Irish economy would grow on the back of export growth by 3.5% next year and an average of about 4% in the years thereafter to get us through this public finance crisis. But when we look at the present performance of our trading partners, of course those projections now appear completely fanciful. The US economy continues to falter, particularly when we look at any net job creation there has been almost fully on the back of public service recruitment because of the census in 2011 that's going to take place in the US next year. And when we look at German export growth, certainly was a lot more muted during the summer months compared to April and May of this year, certainly reflecting the great uncertainty that is hanging over the expectations of growth on both sides of the Atlantic. Unless we see a marked change in the government's strategy to where it attempts to give more support to domestic business activity and to broadening the Irish tax base, I suppose my great fear is that the challenges for the public service are only going to get greater from here on in. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Marie. Marie outlined some of the challenges of the crisis, the pain of the crisis, comparing the impact on public and private, and also putting an onus on unions to communicate the need for reform and structural reforms, including IT reforms, upskilling, training, legislative requirements, and that unions can be part of the solution. And she also outlined the important agent of change, that being FÁS, an agency that's obviously under a lot of attack at the moment, but nonetheless huge state training is required, and FÁS can be part of that training.